Hello, everybody. We are starting our second webinar. And what we will do in this series of webinars, we will explain the work of the Technical Committee 68, Financial Services of the ISO, International Standards Organization. We had the first webinar on 8th of May, and you can see on the YouTube channel of Ukrswift the record of this webinar. We have the second webinar in this series, and this webinar mostly dedicated to the Subcommittee 8. And the Subcommittee 8 is responsible for reference data. And as you know, reference data plays a very important role in financial industry. There are many standards that were developed and are under development, and there are a lot of plans to introduce new standards. And that is why I'm happy to introduce to you Dominique Tanner, who is the chair of the Subcommittee 8 of ISO Technical Committee 68. He is the chair of the subcommittee which deals with the reference data. And we have today with us also Sandra Roth. She is a committee manager of the Subcommittee 8 of Technical Committee 68. So we will work today for 1 hour approximately, and you can also make your questions in the chat if you registered for this webinar, and you have access to the live streaming page. There you can make questions.
Hello, everyone, and thanks very much, Yuri, for the kind introduction, and a warm welcome to the whole audience of this webinar. I'm very pleased that I can show you some of the work that we are doing in TC68 SC8 on standardizing reference data for the benefit of the financial services industry. So this will be the agenda for today. I would like to start off with a bit of a top-down view to give you an overview over the ecosystem on the reference data side for financial services, and talk about the portfolio of standards that we are maintaining. And then in a second stage of the webinar, I will hand over to my colleague Sandra Roth, who is the committee manager for SC8, to show you the current work and also give you an overview of the standards that we, as I said, have in our portfolio. I can explain a little bit on what I mean by the data or reference data ecosystem. We are predominantly concerned with financial services here. And this is just a depiction, a very high level of the kind of entities and objects in the data world that we are dealing with. On the one side, one of the big blocks is obviously parties or legal entities or natural persons that can play a role in financial transactions. And we also have the area of assets or the financial instruments, financial products, currencies, digital tokens, you name it, that play a role in those transactions as well. And we have also the financial markets, which are in scope of our standardization efforts, which play a role with respect to these assets, namely markets, marketplaces, trading venues where these assets can be traded. We also have standards, as I mentioned before, in the area of transactions, financial transactions that are conducted between parties, and they can refer to assets, etc. And we also have a very important standard in our portfolio, which deals with accounts. So these are kind of, as I said, the entities or objects we are primarily concerned with. And if we can move on to the next slide, Yuri, please. There you will see more details around the standard that are maintained and developed within SC8, namely standards in kind of a couple of main areas, I would say. First of all, it's always important to identify the object at hand, i.e., to identify a legal party in a transaction, to identify an asset that you have traded in, or to identify a market or trading venue where a certain asset has been traded. So identification standards is kind of a core, or you could also call it the bread and butter business of our standardization efforts. But we also have standards in the area of classification, i.e., how do you classify a legal entity in terms of their legal form? How do you classify a financial instrument? What type of financial instrument are we looking at? Etc. And we also have standards in the area of naming, i.e., giving specific naming conventions, for instance, to a financial instrument. If we're looking at the standards that play a role in this area, I'll probably like to start from the top left. Actually, one of the very important standards that everyone is using globally are the country codes, the ISO 3166, the country codes, which are very important. They are not a standard which is part of SC8, but we are making heavy use of this other standard, which is actually maintained by ISO Central Secretariat. Then if we move down on the party side, we make a distinction between a legal entity, which can be a company, which can be a government entity, which can be an investment fund, etc., and a natural person, I, you, or me, persons that have an own legal personality but are not classed as legal entities. On the legal entity side, we have two legal entity identification standards that are maintained. The first one, and one that has been gaining a lot of traction over the last couple of years, specifically after the last major financial crisis, is ISO 17442, the LEI, the Legal Entity Identifier. It was widely recognized at the time that regulators and market participants alike didn't have enough information about the exposure to certain legal entities. One example, obviously, would be the demise of Lehman Brothers during the financial crisis, because it was hard to reconcile positions and exposure without having a internationally recognized identifier that is identifying the various parts of a more complex group like Lehman Brothers, or indeed any other larger banking conglomerate. We also have a standard which is a bit older, which is widely used in financial messaging by our colleagues in SC9, which deal with the financial messaging standards, notably ISO 20022. This is ISO 9362, the big code, the business identifier code. Which is used to route messages to the corresponding participants on the SWIFT network, for instance. We also have recently developed a classification standard for legal entities as well. This is ISO 20275, which is the ELF codes, which stands for entity legal form codes, because it is quite important to know what kind of legal form, what kind of legal structure a legal entity takes in their particular jurisdiction. Hence, we have come up with an extensive code list by jurisdiction, classifying entities into their corresponding legal forms in that particular jurisdiction. So you have a better understanding with what kind of company, with what kind of fund you're actually dealing with, and you have the correct information on what kind of legal form this entity belongs to. We have then also moved our attention to natural persons, which is a much more tricky area than legal entities, because you have a lot of differences in various jurisdictions regarding kind of protecting personal rights of people, data protection laws, etc., etc. But nevertheless, we have come up with a first standard around identifying natural persons, which is ISO 24366, the NPI, which stands for Natural Person Identifier. We had actually envisaged to embark on kind of creating more standards around this particular identifier, which is not yet operational, I have to say, but it has proven to be quite tricky and a very ambitious target for us in SC8. And we have just recently decided at our plenary meeting in Sydney 2 weeks ago that we gonna downgrade the development of the ISO 24366 Part 2 to a technical report and not yet make it an international standard. The reason for this is, as I said, the developments are very dynamic on the international scene. A lot of regulators are looking into this topic. A lot of countries have already come up with their own schemes of providing an identity or a person or natural person identifier to their citizens. And we at SC8 felt that for once we were probably a bit ahead of the curve and did not have enough consensus or backing to work on this part 2 of the natural person identifier. What we intend to do, we intend to watch the market very carefully and see where the developments lead us. We will, as I said, conserve all the knowledge that we have gained so far in a technical report, which is also an official ISO document, and resurrect our efforts to produce a truly international natural person identifier with all kind of the bells and whistles around it, identity verification, identity authentication, maintaining registers of information, etc., which satisfy personality and data protection laws in all the jurisdictions at a later stage. Moving on, we have just released another important standard, because you can actually relate natural persons in various roles to legal entities. And in order to facilitate that and get general consensus around definitions, etc., we have come up with ISO 5009, the official organization roles that a natural person can take on with respect to a legal entity. You can think of things like someone, a natural person, being the chairman of the board of directors of a company, or being a member of the board of directors. You might have roles in certain jurisdictions of a managing director of a company or a finance director of a company, etc. So ISO 5009 is actually standardizing these official roles between natural persons and legal entities. Then moving on to the next big block, that's basically the block which stands at the center of the work and is probably the cornerstone of what SC8 has been doing in the past. Um, we have identification standards, and this is probably one of the most widely known standards in the financial services industry of SC8 around the identification of financial instruments, and this is ISO 6166, the ISIN standards, or the International Securities Identification Number. So we are numbering all the financial instruments globally through the ISIN number. What we have added as well is a classification standard which goes alongside the ISIN standard, and this is ISO 10962, which is the CFI standard, which stands for Classification of Financial Instruments. This is a standard which is accompanying, as I said, the ISIN standard. And for each ISIN, you can also get a CFI code, which tells you what kind of financial instrument you're looking at, whether you're looking at an equity instrument, debt instrument, a warrant, a subscription right, an options contract, a futures contract, etc., with some more detail to it. The third standard we have developed in this area is ISO 18774, which is the FISN standard, which stands for Financial Instrument Short Name. This is basically an internationally recognized way of abbreviating the description or the name of a financial instrument, and which is standardized and also very helpful in the exchange of information between parties servicing the financial industry. What is also probably quite well known is the standard for currency codes, ISO 4217. You have things like GBP for pound sterling, USD for US dollars. So a lot of people, even outside the financial industry, will recognize this standard because those currency codes are printed on invoices, on receipts, when you do transactions, maybe in a foreign country, etc. And this is also an identification standard which is maintained within the scope of SC8. One of the more recent developments we have undertaken to kind of also get ahead of the curve in the digital financial ecosystem is the development of the DTI standard, ISO 24165, which is the digital token identifier. This is an additional identifier for everything that is tokenized and is part or is in scope of the definition of a digital token as per the standard. If you have more questions on that, obviously, or any of the other standards that I'm mentioning and their interrelationship, then please feel free to ask questions. If I move over now to the right, we also have an identification standard for markets or trading venues. This is ISO 10383, the MIC code, the market identifier code, which is already quite heavily used by regulators, specifically in Europe, to identify the trading venues where certain transactions have taken place. Also, another standard, if I move slightly up from the assets and move on to the financial products, basically what we mean by those financial products, we mean OTC derivative contracts, which are widely traded, things like swaps, forwards, etc. And we have been tasked by the regulators, specifically again in Europe, but also in the US, to come up with a identification standard on the product level, not on the level of an individual transaction between two parties in these contracts, but defining a standard on the product level, i.e., on the level of the template, I would call it, for the transaction, which gives you the major terms and conditions of such a product. This will be used by regulators and other market participants to roll up individual transactions that are reported to them and then get a better understanding of the counterparty exposure in those contracts between the different market participants. If I move slightly to the south of this picture, I have already talked about individual transactions in the financial industry. We also have a standard in our portfolio, ISO 23897, the UTI, which deals with the unique identification of transactions. And in this respect, UTI stands for Unique Transaction Identification. Transactions usually take part in the financial services industry on accounts, or transactions are posted to accounts. And on the bottom here, we obviously have another very probably well-known standard within the portfolio of SE8, which is ISO 13616, which is the IBAN standard, the International Bank Account Number standard. So these standards, specifically the account standard IBAN and also the transaction identification standard, the UTI, is basically geared to facilitate the financial transactions which are happening cross-border between market participants. So it is very heavily used again by our colleagues in SC9 in their financial messaging standards. We also have a later edition, which is the box on the top right corner, on banking products. This was a standard which was spearheaded by our colleagues in China because they felt it necessary to create a standard, which is ISO 21586, to describe banking products and services. So this is a standard that helps to describe what kind of products a bank can offer, for instance, in terms of different loans, accounts like savings accounts, current accounts, but also other types of services, and gives a standard on how these products can best be described and also compared to each other. So this is kind of a very high level overview over the standards which form part of the portfolio of SC8. And I'm quite happy to hand over now to my colleague, Sandra, who will show you the current developments and the different stages that various standards are now in either their revisions or their development. So thanks very much, and over to you, Sandra.
Hi, this is here with us. We have Sandra Roth. Sandra is a committee manager for TC68 Subcommittee 8. We will go to the presentation right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yuri. Then we can see a little bit further down, and I only look into those standards which are written in more darker color. So we have here the ISO 18774, the FISM standard. This one has been mandated to be revised when there was a systematic review and the working group 10 is there preparing a committee draft. So you have the various levels of the draft before a international standard is published. You first start with a working draft on a working group level, then you bring it up to a committee level, where the committee members, the national member bodies, review the committee draft and then report back their comments, what they observe. Then the working group reviews the comments, disposes them, and then prepares a draft international standard where then all ISO members review the draft international standard. And once this one is approved and all the comments have been disposed, then the document can go into publication. These are the steps here, and for the FISM we are at the committee draft level. Then a little bit down you can see the ISO 24165, the DTI. This standard as well is in revision, and both parts here are in revision. If you look at the two lines below the broader red line with the new projects, there you can see we have two new standards that are in development. The first one is the part 2 of the NPI, the Natural Person Identifier. And here Dominique already told us that the group has been mandated to prepare a technical report, not a international standard anymore. And then on the last line you have the VLEI. It's a third part of the LEI standard. Please allow me to go into more details. Let's start with the next slide with the DTI. Thank you, Yuri. So for some standards, we have a registration authority assigned for the issuance of identifiers. The product advisory group of the DTI has in various discussions with the market participants found out that some questions in the application of the DTI need to be reviewed by the experts. Our working group 3, under the lead of Mr. Ryan Pierce, is taking care of these questions, and you can see these questions listed here. I would like only to point out the first question. Till date, the DTI was only issued for fungible tokens, and the group is now evaluating if the standard should be opened to cover as well non-fungible tokens. The various other questions are listed here, but I think it's interesting to see them, but I won't go into the details here. What might be of more interest is many member bodies, also Ukraine, are member of TC 307. This is the technical committee for blockchain. Here we have to make sure that we are closely aligned with this technical committee to closely collaborate here to make sure that we have a standard that also fulfills all the technical requirements from the blockchain side. Let's go to the next slide. Here we have work of the working group 7, which is the part 2 of the Natural Person Identifier. Here the focus is on the life cycle operational management, and as Dominique mentioned, we were quite ahead of the curve in developing this standard. If you look at the identified life cycle operation and you focus there on the identification of natural persons, the authentication of their documentation, and the issuance of an identifier, it's quite challenging to develop or define something, a governance framework that is then applicable for the whole world. Since we want to make sure that it's also from a security perspective safe, the identification authentication is done in a proper way. It's quite a challenge to make sure that you are internationally aligned, and therefore the group has been mandated to develop now a technical report. It's less formative and normative than an international standard, but it helps us to have then all the findings of the group bundled together in one document. And whenever time is mature to start the work again on an international standard, then we can use this technical report as a starting point. Let us go to the next slide. I'm sorry, for the working group 7, I forgot to mention the convener there is Mr. Patrick Curry. For the working group 10, the convener here is Mr. Uwe Meyer. He leads the group, and the main topic here is to close the gaps to instrument types which haven't yet been covered by the standard. These are, for example, the OTC derivatives, carbon credits, and emission certificates. And the work here has already proceeded, and the committee draft will be submitted for ballot shortly. For this group and also for the next group, the work has progressed quite well and is proceeded quite far. Therefore, it would make sense to join these groups. But for the previous 2 groups, for the working group 7 and working group 3, it would be very much of interest for the working groups to gain more experts to the groups that can participate and contribute to the work. So this was about the revision of the FISN, and if you could please go to the last slide. This is about the VLEI. This group is led by Mrs. Carla McKenna. Those of you who have already joined the first webinar have met her during that webinar. She is developing with the group the third part of the LEI. And as you know, digital certificates, even though highly applicable or widely used and covered in many legislations, however, they haven't solved digital identity entirely. And since certificates are not unique, the information contained within might be outdated, and revocation has always been an issue. Furthermore, there are so many schemes at the same time, and a digital certificate issued in one country under the local scheme might not be usable by the owners in another country. Digital certificates, therefore, are not operationally and semantically or interoperable, especially within the context of the chains of trust. So the goal is here to integrate the LEIs in VLEI authenticated chain data container credentials with the ACDC credentials to combine the advantages of both. This will then result in a unique identification of businesses, the legal entities, and the cryptographic verification of identification associated with the digital credentials. Here, the committee draft has already been distributed, and the working group is now preparing the draft international standard, so progressed quite far. Yeah, this is about the current work, the open work in SC8. And with this, I would also conclude my part, Yuri. Don't know if there are questions from some participants in this here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sandra. Thank you very much for this presentation. So it is much clearer for us what's going on in the area of reference data. So what is the work of your subcommittee, and what's the technical committee 68 doing in this direction? And we have few questions, but before these questions, I maybe also should say a few words from our side, from the side of Ukrainian community, because for us standards, it's not something theoretical. It is very, very practical thing. It took us 10 years for Ukraine to implement IBAN, for example, and right now all Ukrainian entities, either physical or legal entities, they have IBAN number when they open account with a bank, which dramatically increases the STP rates. So there are less failures, and this is very, very, very important, very good. The second thing, this is you mentioned also the country codes. And country codes are also very, very practical. Because when Russia occupied Crimea, they took over Ukrainian banks. And these banks were using Ukrainian country codes in their BICs. This way, Russians were able to avoid sanctions. It was the only reason how we managed at that time to disconnect those banks from the SWIFT network, which were just under the occupation. So this is this is very, very practical. Also, with the LEIs, we had a project in Ukraine, so we supposed to issue LEIs for all exporters and importers in Ukraine. Unfortunately, because of occupation, the legal entities in most cases are terrorized by Russian terrorists. So that is why, unfortunately, our registers, I mean official registers, they are closed, and you cannot use them. Terrorists actually just accessing this data and terrorizing the legal entities on occupied territories. That is why right now this project doesn't work. Anyway, it is very, very important for sanctions and for working with legal entities, and we hope that in the future we will use this legal entity identifier more and more in our practice everywhere. So this is what happens with the standards, and this is thanks to the work of your subcommittee 8, who created a lot of these standards, not only creating, also just supporting and developing. You said this is a natural person identifier, which is very, very important, and we really do understand all the problems that you have just trying to maintain this standard in international communities, because maybe not every countries want to have the unified identifier for their citizens, for their people, for obvious reasons, because we have right now not everywhere it is at peace, so we have to move forward with what we have. But anyway, we need this, and thank you very much for the great work you are doing. So we have also some questions from the audience. So I'd like to ask. So first question, I don't know, maybe this is for you, Sandra, or maybe Dominique can answer this question. The first is maybe practical question. It's not about the standards themselves, but about the process. So what is the average number of team members for different stages of standard developments? I mean, so how many people practically are involved when you develop new standard? So maybe could you provide some examples as well? Sandra,
Perhaps,
yeah,
perhaps I can start, and Dominic, please add. So there is a minimum of 5 member bodies needed for that you can start. Otherwise, it's not something that is internationally then substantiated. So we always need a minimum of 5 people or 5 member bodies that work in such a group. Our average is between 15 and 20 experts per group. There is also the liaisons considered. So we have not only member bodies from countries, we have 28 member bodies in SC8, we have also liaisons. And these are various organizations. For example, for the natural person identifier, we have UNHCR, for stateless people, refugees, because they also need a natural person identifier, and this expertise, this know-how is then contributed by the UNHCR experts. So 15 to 20 is the rough average per group. Does this answer the question?
Yes, thank you, thank you very much. And also the next question we have, maybe Dominique can help with this question. Again, this is not about the specific standards that we were just reviewing today, standards of subcommittee 8 of the technical committee 68, but it's again about the process, because Ukrainian audience are just very interested. So what the process is. So the question is following: who are the main ideologists for the new standards development? So for example, so you somehow, so the question is how the new standards sprang off. So maybe you can say, Dominique, a few words.
Yes, that's a very good question, definitely. Basically, any member of SC8 can make a proposal for a new standard. And this is called an NWPI, a new work item proposal. Usually, this is already in the form of a draft standard, kind of the outline of what should be standardized, etc. There are some formal requirements which need to be followed, which are set by ISO Central Secretariat. When such a new work item proposal comes in, and obviously Sandra, please chip in if you want to add something. New work item proposal is then balloted through the membership. So we need a certain level of consensus from our membership. And this is, by the way, just the voting members, the so-called P members, which are the national standardization bodies that are part of SC8, who can actually vote. If we have large enough consensus on a new work item proposal with the community, with the P members, we are also asking basically at the same time the question, which of these countries would be able to delegate experts to the development of such a standard? Because as Sandra has just mentioned, we need at least 5 member bodies to delegate experts to actually being able to start the work. So if we have a positive ballot result on the new work item proposal and we get enough experts, then we can actually start the work on a new standard, a new international standard. Sandra, I don't know, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that perfectly answers the question. But it depends on the person who asked the question, if there is a follow-up question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, we have another one question. This is regarding cryptocurrencies, operations and standards. And the question is, what type of reference data and standards of reference data you supposed to make? And for the cryptocurrencies, maybe it's mostly for CBDC, for central bank digital currencies. They definitely need some reference data standards. So do you have some standards?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, specifically with regards to CDBC, central bank digital currency. We actually had a study group on the level of TC68, or basically we still have a study group on TC68 level, looking at the implications of CDBC as well as other digital currencies like your Bitcoins, Ethers, Ripples, etc., etc. It's probably a bit early stages, but what we can definitely say, a number of standards will actually be applied. On the one hand, you have to question whether a digital currency would get a currency code, like these 3-letter currency code that I've been mentioning. Answer for CDBC would be most likely yes. A digital version of central bank money could get a 3-letter ISO currency code, but not any non-fiat digital currency like Bitcoin or Ether. What we have developed with the DTI, and Sandra and I have spoken about that, is an identifier, an ISO identifier, which is specifically suited to the digital ecosystem, and each digital currency can get a DTI, and most digital currencies like Bitcoin, Ether, Ripple, Cardano, etc., have already been allocated a digital token identifier. The register of the DTI is public, and you can basically access it through any web browser and download that data. We have also looked at the application of ISINs. As you might know, ISINs can also be allocated to currencies, and ISINs can also be allocated to any digital representation of assets that fall within the scope of the ISIN standard. I.e., a digital currency can get an ISIN number. The digital equivalent of an equity instrument or the digital equivalent of a bond instrument, etc., can also get an ISIN. What is excluded so far is if you're going to tokenize, let's say, a percentage or a fractional ownership on a Van Gogh painting or something like that, which has no representation in the real world under the scope of ISIN, of the ISIN standard, then obviously this couldn't get an ISIN, but it could still get a digital token identifier. There are other standards, auxiliary standards, which we are looking at. Obviously, there is the FISN standard, the short names, the CFI standard, etc. So we are currently in the process of actually putting everything together and kind of come up with a map of ISO standards within the scope of SC8, obviously, that are kind of suited to the new digital ecosystem. Does that answer your question, or is there any follow-up?
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. Very interesting, all these developments and what you have in mind. So because really the process of digitalization or tokenization of everything really needs standardization support. Really just to make it work, because otherwise without the standard it will be very difficult to know what you are dealing with. And again, as we just discussed this before, so the standards they play the role of the language, and the better common language we have, the better we can communicate, and the better we can do business, and the better we can develop this world for good together. Great, thank you very much. However, we have another one question regarding Ukrainian community. So as you know, so the whole series of webinars were started because Ukraine decided to get rid of old ghost Russian-based, standards from back from the Soviet Union, and adopt at once in one go European standards and international standards. So that is why the question is actually from the audience, so how we as Ukrainian community can help for the development of standards. What do you think? So how we can support your activities, and so what we as Ukrainian community can do to just to develop and implement these new standards, especially reference data, of course.
I think this is a membership and liaison question. Can I pass this on to Sandra?
Okay. Okay, Sandra, do you have any comments?
So since State Enterprise Ukrainian Scientific Research and Training Center for Standardization, Certification and Quality Programs is already a ISO member, I would suggest that you reach out to this body, ask them to apply to become a member of TC68 SE8, and we would be very happy to have you. And once you are then member, first you will be an observing member, but as observing member, you are also entitled to work in the groups. So as soon as you are a registered member, you can be registered to working groups, and then you can immediately start to participate. But yeah, please reach out to the Ukraine. Yeah, this whole full name, you know it better than I do.
Okay, Ukra and then say, yeah, of course, we will do that. Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. Yes, we need, just to keep up and to maintain the process, so it works better from both sides. And now we have another one question, maybe the last one. This is from all the list of questions that I see. And yeah, this one is, I don't know, maybe Sandra, you can answer this question, maybe Dominique. Anyway, the question is, so how you as a subcommittee of Technical Committee 68 or just Technical Committee 68 in general review or just have feedback for the country standards. So, for example, if the country standards are complying with the international standards or not. So, what is let's say a feedback from your subcommittee to the local either mirror committees that you have in countries, or just simply communities who are also doing localization, if any, if there is any influence from your side. So Sandra, maybe you can answer this question, or Dominique.
I can briefly start, but I think Dominic might be in a better position to allude. But we are in our roles, and Dominic and I, we are both 6 members, so we are working for 6 the organization, but we have a special role in the ISO work, nominated by the Swiss National Standardization Body. So our work is in the ISO area. It's a normative work. So we try to bring people together, the experts together. Yuri, you mentioned we are working towards the greater good. So this is our primary scope. How the local members, the national members, adopt the standards in their countries, this is not in our control. But they have usually then their own national standards, and there they make it visible, transparent, what the adoption on national level is.
Okay.
Maybe a very practical comment from my side also to that question. It goes into the direction of adaptation of standards. Obviously, a lot of our standards are already quite widely adapted in the financial services industry, and there are kind of 2 reasons for that. First of all, as our standards are international, they're here to further cross-border trading between parties in different countries. Even if country A and country B don't have the same standard. Let's make an example. In the UK, you would identify a financial instrument with a CDOL number. In the US, you would have a QSIP number. But if those 2 parties wanted to talk to each other, then they need to have a common standard, which is the ISIN number. So a lot of the adaptation has actually been driven by the market participants themselves to further the cross-border trading. That is one reason why the standards are quite widely adopted, because they're very useful in communicating. The other one is because of the adaptation of standards through regulators, predominantly in Europe and the US. ESMA in Europe, but also the SEC and other bodies in the US have adopted a lot of the ISO standards, like the LEI, like the ISIN, like a MIC code, etc., for their regulatory reporting purposes. For instance, in Europe, you cannot do transaction reporting to ESMA or any competent authority in the EU or European Economic Area without giving them an ISIN and a MIC code where you identify the instrument and identify the trading venue where this instrument has been traded. So a lot of these things have been mandated by regulators, and this has also helped us very much in actually reaching a high degree of adoption of these standards. Probably a bit less adopted are the standards in the Asia Pacific region, mainly in kind of smaller or lesser developed countries, but kind of the larger financial centers like Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, India, etc., are also showing a wide adoption of these standards. I don't know, is this satisfactory as an answer, or is there any follow-up?
Oh yes, yes. Thank you very much. It is clear. Of course, it's not so straightforward and obvious to understand these relationships and feedback loops, let's say. But anyway, it's always good to know how standards are developing and what are the processes underneath these developments. So, Dominique, thank you very much for clarification. So yes, and actually I see that we don't have any questions more, and we just work exactly 1 hour as we just supposed to do. So with this, I would like to thank you, Dominique and Sandra, for these nice presentations. Maybe you want to say a few words to people who will see our webinar. So maybe just to wrap up, Dominique.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And I thank everyone who participated in today's call, showing an interest in the work we're doing on international standards for the financial services community. So I'm very pleased that people are showing this interest, obviously, in what we're doing. And I would also like to encourage everyone who is getting a bit inspired by today's session to reach out to their national bodies. I mean, we have heard who it is in the Ukraine, etc. But you can also work in our community through liaisons. DC 307 already has, Ukraine has already a membership there, so there is another route in. So every experts, every diversity of opinion is always welcome, because we develop standards based on international consensus for the greater good, as Sandra has mentioned, for the whole community. So thanks everyone, and that's it from my side.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dominique. And Sandra, from your side, just to wrap up.
Just thank you for your attendance, for your questions, very interesting questions, and I hope we stay in touch and you will join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we also, from Ukrainian financial community, from Ukrswift, we want to say thank you very much for attending this webinar. Thank you very much for your interest in standards. And because standards are always in your life, they are around you, whether you want it or not, but they are here and they will be here. So it's always better to be part of the standards development and implementation than just staying aside. So Thank you very much for everybody, and we will have the recording of this webinar on YouTube. We will have also subtitles in Ukrainian language. If you will have any questions, you can reach anytime to Ukrswift, to Ukr NDNC. This is Ukrainian standardization body, and also you can reach with your questions to us, and we pass them to the TC68, and we will work obviously with the reference data with SC8. So we thank you very much. Thank you, Dominique. Thank you, Sandra, for your time and very interesting presentations. I also would like to mention Paul D'Amico, who was heavily involved from communications from TC68 to make this webinar happen, just to prepare everything. And with this, thank you very much, and we will see you next time in our next webinars about standardization TC68. Thank you. Bye-bye.